Committee on the Budget's hearing today on the Congressional Budget Office's Budget and Economic Outlook will commence. We will hear testimony from Director Swagel of the Congressional Budget Office. Welcome, Dr. Swagel. I would now like to yield myself such time as I may consume. We're talking about FISA this week, which is an issue of national security. And I want to quote Admiral Mullen's comment at a hearing, a defense hearing, where when asked what the biggest threat to national security was, his response was, the biggest threat to national security is our national debt. Jerome Powell, the Fed chairman, at a hearing, a defense hearing, where when asked what the biggest threat to national security was, his response was, the biggest threat to national security is our national debt. Jerome Powell, the Fed chairman, who probably is loath to opine on fiscal policy, in a 60 Minutes interview said, the national debt, our fiscal path, is completely unsustainable, and it's an urgent matter that we must address. I think that's significant, and that's some backdrop to the budget baseline update from February. Most recently was in May of 23, and then this recent update here in February. Bottom line is, on Valentine's Day, when we think about how much we love our significant others, one could ask, how much do we love the country? How much do we love our children's future in the country? Well, as Shakespeare said, let me count the ways. Maybe the ways we're not loving our country well. $20 trillion in additional debt over the next 10 years, from $34 trillion, record high, to $54 trillion. Clearly, the mandatory spending is driving this. Demographics, but also inflation. Inflation is significant. We'll dig into that. That's because of the COLAs, the cost of living adjustments. In these entitlement programs, we're spending a lot more money. Not to mention the 10,000 baby boomers retiring a day. That adds to this unsustainable fiscal path. Interest cost. Interest rates are recently in record highs, and the interest expense on the debt is exploding. In fact, the revision from May to February, in just months, was $125 billion in additional cost to service the debt. That's more than the Homeland Security Department. That's more than the budget of commerce and education. The debt, or the interest on the debt, rather, is now higher than we spend on all of national defense, if the $870 billion projections come true. Some project it'll be upwards of $1 trillion. Of the $20 trillion in additional debt, because of the current policies and programs of the federal government, we're going to see over 60% of all of that cost in interest alone. Not anything to address the solvency of our senior safety nets, not anything to help ensure our soldiers and sailors are safe and successful in the most important job to provide a common defense, not a dollar or a dime to infrastructure, just paying China, Japan, and other bondholders of U.S. Treasuries because of our massive deficit spending and debt appetite, which was $1.7 trillion, the annual deficit, last year, which is more than the entire deficit, the discretionary budget that we're fighting over, and often between my own party. So there is great concern, and yet there's a silver lining in your report. I'm anxious to hear more about it, Dr. Swagel. You mentioned that one bright spot is that the deficit spending has actually gone down year over year in the short run. It's eclipsed by the growth in mandatory and interest in the 10-year, but year over year, deficit spending goes down because Republicans decided to use basically the action-forcing mechanism and moment of the debt ceiling to bring my Democrat colleagues to the table and negotiate a spending cap deal. That FRA spending cap deal that was bipartisan, that we passed and the president signed into law, will save $1.6 trillion over 10 years. So as Moody's and Fitch mentioned in their report, as they downgraded our credit rating and our outlook, we need to do more FRA deals that reduce spending, but we need to focus on mandatory programs. And by the way, in 10 years, mandatory spending, or that spending which is on autopilot, goes from under 75% of the total budget of the United States to 80% or 79%, almost 80% of the entire budget. So we have a bipartisan fiscal commission, Dr. Swagel, that would focus on the long-term unfunded liabilities, that would address what Fitch and Moody's suggested, that we have a long-term plan, and that we have both parties at the table to address it. If we could keep doing the FRA, modest improvements on the controlling spending on discretionary and get serious about reining in this runaway spending on the mandatory side, we might save this country. We might give Jerome Powell something to be more confident and sanguine about with respect to America's fiscal future. Again, thanks for coming. We appreciate your time and insights. And with that, I yield to my ranking member for as much time as he may consume.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome back, Dr. Swagel. There is no debate, none whatsoever. America's economy is the strongest in the world and the envy of other developed nations. No economy on earth has recovered more quickly and more strongly than that of the American economy. Here are the facts to back that up. There have been just under 15 million jobs created since President Biden took office. In fact, we may very well hit the 15 million mark next month. That's more jobs created in this presidential term than any other previous term in history. The 3-month average job growth is 289,000 jobs a month. The unemployment rate at 3.7% has now been under 4% for the last 2 years. Historic. This economy now has, to those who spread the false claim that we're just regaining the jobs lost during COVID, consider this fact. The economy today has 5.4 million more jobs than before COVID. In 2023, GDP growth was 2.5% year over year. And on inflation, which has ravaged every single economy on earth as we came back from COVID, inflation here in the United States has fallen from the peak of 9% last summer to now only 3%. And finally, consumer confidence, which was one area that was until recently lagging, consumer confidence has turned around and now hit a 2-year high. None of this was achieved by accident. It happened because when our nation was struggling, Democrats in this administration worked together to take action to rescue our economy, invest in working families, rebuild our infrastructure, and bring manufacturing back to America. So let's make sure as we move forward, we don't do anything that risks these historic economic gains. Now, transitioning, Dr. Swagel, to what we will hear from you in terms of next year's projection and perhaps longer term than next year. We do, of course, in the long term, have our challenges. Every single nation in Western civilization is having to deal with the fact that our population, or I should say the percentage of those who are older, is increasing. And that does put certain fiscal demands on our entitlement programs. But I remind people who sometimes forget, when we say entitlements, these are earned benefits. Social Security, Medicare, These are programs that workers paid into over a lifetime of work. As we are looking to address in the long term the challenges we have with both trust funds, we must do nothing whatsoever that would imperil those programs or push through devastating cuts that are absolutely unwarranted and unjustified. So, Dr. Swagel, many more things I could say on this topic, but I will pause there, and I look forward to hearing from your testimony. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Boyle. In the interest of time, and if any other member has an opening statement, I ask you submit it for the record. I'll hold the record open at the end of the day to accommodate those members who may not have prepared written statements. I'd like to recognize Director Swagel now and thank him again for his time, and yield the floor to you for 5 minutes.
Great. Thank you, Chairman Arrington, Ranking Member Boyle, and members of the committee. Thank you for inviting me to testify about the budget and economic outlook. I'll talk first about the federal budget and then briefly discuss the economy. In the budget projections we released last week, the deficit grows to $2.6 trillion in 2034. Measured in relation to economic output, deficits during the coming decade are about 50% larger than their historical average over the past 50 years. Net interest costs are a major contributor to the deficit, and their growth is equal to about 3/4 of the increase in the deficit from 2024 to 2034. By the end of that 10-year period, net interest costs are roughly 1.5 times larger than either defense or non-defense discretionary spending. Now, also boosting deficits are two familiar underlying trends: the aging of the population and growth in federal health care costs per beneficiary. Those trends put upward pressure on mandatory spending. Measured in relation to economic output, federal debt held by the public rises from 99% in 2024 to 116% in 2034, surpassing its historical peak. Debt continues to rise, reaching 172% of GDP 30 years out. From 2024 to 2033, the deficit is about 7% smaller than we projected last year, primarily as a result of the Fiscal Responsibility Act of 2023 and the subsequent continuing resolutions. Together, those laws reduce the growth of discretionary spending, including the effects on debt service. Legislative changes in total reduce deficits by $2.6 trillion over the next 10 years. That's all the legislative changes. In our projections, the deficit is also smaller than it was last year because economic output is greater, partly as a result of more people working. The labor force in 2033 is larger by 5.2 million people, mostly because of higher net immigration. As a result of those changes in the labor force, we estimate that from 2023 to 2034, GDP will be about $7 trillion larger, and revenues will be higher by about $1 trillion than would have been otherwise. Now, immigration is also associated with increased spending and with many other effects, and we are continuing to assess the implications of immigration for revenues and for spending. So two key factors partially offset the deficit reduction compared to last year's projections. The first is that net interest costs rise as a result of higher interest rates. And then second is that the cost of the energy-related tax provisions are much higher than the staff of the Joint Committee on Taxation originally projected. And those costs reflect new emission standards, market developments, and actions taken by the administration to implement the tax provisions. Our next update to these budget projections will come this spring and will incorporate the actual data about 2023 budget outcomes that typically accompany the release of the president's budget, as well as other new information, including about any new rules, any new administrative actions that have come into place since early January when we finalized the projections we're discussing today. To keep you informed on a regular basis about the status of the deficit, we issue the monthly budget review showing federal spending and revenue totals for the previous month and the fiscal year to date. Let me briefly turn to the economic projections. The U.S. economy grew faster in 2023 than it did in 2022, even as inflation slowed. We do see economic growth slowing in 2024, with slightly higher unemployment and continued lower inflation. We expect the Federal Reserve, to eventually respond by reducing interest rates starting around the middle of the calendar year. Since February 2023, when we last published our full economic forecast, we have lowered our projections of economic growth and inflation for this year, in part because last year was so strong. We expect interest rates to be a bit higher over the next couple of years than we projected last year, but then after 2027, our projections are generally similar to what we had before. Let me stop there, and I am happy to be here and happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Swagel. We'll now begin with the question and answer session. I'll give myself 5 minutes. So when I think about what's happening with the cost of living in this country, I see it as an imbalance between supply and demand, and I just want to make sure as an economist you understand it the same way. We had an administration and policies of this administration that squeezed supply with higher taxes, with higher and more regulations, higher cost, and with paying people more than they made in their previous job for a long time, which created a labor shortage. We still have a lower job participation rate than we did prior to COVID. That's the supply side squeeze. On the demand, overstimulating demand, we flooded the market with federal money. Started with $1 trillion in so-called COVID relief. We had $1 trillion from prior COVID relief unspent. The IRA was supposed to be deficit reducing, or at least pay for itself. Now I think your update is that it will cost $300 billion in additional deficit spending. And the total debt, new debt since this president's been in office, is $6 trillion. So you've got squeeze in demand, in supply and overstimulated demand. You have record 40-year inflation. Is that how you see it? And is that an accurate depiction of what has brought us to the recent inflationary environment?
Right. No, that's consistent with the way we've looked at inflation, is that imbalance between demand and the supply constraints.
Is inflation causing an increase in mandatory spending because earned benefit programs and other mandatory spending programs are going up because there's a COLA or an index for cost of living, and that's causing tens of billions of dollars in increased cost to the taxpayers and in our budget forecast?
Yes, that's right. Inflation plays out into the mandatory spending and then also into the interest costs, because higher inflation translates into higher interest rates.
Why are interests going up? Are interests going up to try to tamp down on inflation by causing growth to recede so that we can cool off this cost of living crisis? Aren't interest hikes directly related to inflation, which I would submit are directly related to the overspending and the squeezing of the supply side? Is that a fair characterization?
No, I think that's right, that the Fed responded to the high interest rates by taking action high inflation by taking action to raise interest rates.
I try to be careful not to blame the president for everything or my Democrat colleagues for everything, but I think their failed economic policies and their unbridled spending has put us in a situation where we have to bring these costs down. Let's talk about the interest for a minute. Prior to President Biden taking office, your projections over the 10 years for interest expense related to servicing the debt was about $4.5 trillion. Today, it's over $12 trillion. I think that the interest cost for the year the president took office was about $340 billion. Today, your new projection is, as I said, higher than the expense of the national defense of the greatest country and military in the world, $870 billion. Is that a fair depiction of our balance sheet and some of these factors?
Yeah, no, absolutely. That, as you said, interest costs are now above defense spending.
So Republicans were much maligned for pushing back on the debt ceiling. It was, to me, a flashing red light, if not yellow, saying Your debt is now at the highest levels, debt to GDP. The path is unsustainable. The unfunded liability 30 years out, 120 trillion. And we were accused of being reckless for saying, wait a minute, we have an opportunity to have a conversation. Republicans led the debt ceiling negotiations. As a result, we got the FRA deal. Some of us, including me, thought it should be more aggressive at reducing spending on the discretionary side. But regardless, the bipartisan outcome was a reset of the baseline and slower growth in discretionary, saving 1.6 trillion. Is that a fair characterization?
Right, and that's what you see in our projections. The change in the deficit, the lower deficit, is coming from those legislative actions.
Well, my time's expired, so I will now yield to my ranking member for 5 minutes for his questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and it did snow in my district yesterday. I appreciate you not blaming President Biden for that snowstorm. In the litany of things that Democrats and the president are sometimes blamed for. One thing I think that the president and Democrats in Congress can be credited for is this remarkable economy that I talked about in my opening statement. Approximately 1 year ago, probably the last time, you were last week, but you were also here about a year ago sitting at that table. Everything you could read, from Bloomberg to Forbes to down the line, was projecting a recession. Literally one headline from about a year ago said, 100% chance of a recession. Did we end up having a recession this past year?
No, it doesn't look like it. And I would say our economic forecast is consistent with that, with the sort of what people think of as a soft landing.
It has been a remarkable economy and economic growth. Is there any projection over the course of the next 12 months that we would drop into a recession?
No, we have the economy slowing with the high interest rates, but job growth continuing to be positive.
And on the interest rate point, I believe the Fed has foreshadowed 3 interest rate cuts, and the markets are actually pricing in 4. Is that your understanding?
That's right, and our forecast has 3 rate cuts this year and then more after that.
And certainly if there would be more after that, that would improve the amount that we're currently spending on interest to service the debt, correct?
That's right, lower interest rates would reduce the net interest outlays.
Yeah. Let me transition here just to healthcare spending, because one of the great things to have happened really over the last decade is that Medicare spending has actually slowed and flattened, somewhat unexpectedly. Many experts believe and cite the Affordable Care Act as responsible for these savings. So does CBO's baseline continue to project a slowdown in Medicare spending per person compared to what it would have been otherwise?
No, it does, and it's something we've looked at very carefully. The Affordable Care Act reduced some of the payment rates to providers like hospitals, and that reduces the trajectory of Medicare costs. There are other factors. There's better cardiac care. There's some slower price growth for drugs. We're still looking at it carefully to see what are the other factors that lead to slower growth in Medicare.
Let me ask you, though, and drill down a little bit then. Do you believe that the ACA's improved access to health care and cost-cutting measures may have contributed to the slowing of Medicare spending per person over the last decade?
Yes, it's something we're still looking at, but there is evidence that some of the provisions in the ACA reduce the cost growth in healthcare.
That is wonderful news, and certainly the last thing then that we would want to do is eliminate the Affordable Care Act or Obamacare, as some candidates for office, for national office, are proposing to do right now. With that, I will yield back to preserve more time for remaining members. Thank you, Mr. Swag.
I thank my ranking member and now recognize the gentleman from your Keystone State, Mr. Smucker, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, Director Swagel. Appreciate your leadership at CBO and the work of your team. Obviously, CBO is the organization that all members of Congress look to for an even-handed, fair view of where we stand and what things will look like in the future. And you've done, I think, a good job of fielding questions from different perspectives and providing that accurate look for members of Congress. This forecast is a 10-year forecast, which you're forecasting at the end of this 10 years will be at 116% debt to GDP, which will be a record high. You've also looked in other reports and at various times throughout the year at a longer-term forecast, up to 30 years. Can you explain to us what debt to GDP looks like in those forecasts at the end of a 30-year period?
No, thank you. And in the 10-year outlook, at the very back, we have a box that gives a preview of that 30-year report, but it's something that we're working on now and we'll have out in the spring. And the challenge that the high deficits continue out into the future, and therefore debt mounts and goes north of 150% of GDP by the end of that 30-year horizon.
Over 150%. One of your reports, I think, had up to close to 180%.
That's right, it's getting close to that.
It's still about right. Almost getting close to double, which is something that every member of Congress ought to be concerned about, correct?
That's right.
Can you tell us a little bit, like it's not sustainable, I think you've talked about that. What's a sort of a best case scenario? It's going to be rising interest rates that are going to impact the ability of the government to fund anything. And worst case scenario would be what?
No, that's right.
Based on what's happened in history.
Right, so net interest payments, the rising net interest payments will crowd out other activities, other choices that you as policymakers have. And the worst case scenario are risks of instability, of financial instability, if global investors doubt the willingness of the United States to pay its debt without giving in to high inflation.
And that would be a sovereign debt crisis.
That would be a debt crisis or an inflation crisis.
Yeah, which would have massive impacts on every American. Do you agree with that?
That's right.
And in fact, we've seen countries fail in similar situations throughout history. You agree with that?
I do.
Yeah. So you're the independent voice telling every member of Congress that this is really an existential crisis to the future of the country. Is that correct?
No, I think that's fair. And as you said, I would look at other countries that have failed this challenge.
Do you think the American people understand what we're faced with?
I mean, I'd like to think there's broad awareness that we face a serious problem. The difficulty is finding the way to address it.
The purpose, and I'm sorry, I'm doing this quickly, but the purpose of a debt commission, I believe, one of the main purposes is to really explain this to the American people. Do you see value in that?
No, I do, explaining the problem and then saying here are the range of possible solutions.
Yes, which is exactly what we're hoping to set out to do with the debt commission. Can you explain just for a second what your projections are? And the ranking member talked about Social Security and Medicare as being programs that have been paid into and so in some sense earned. But what will happen with those programs in less than 10 years if nothing is done?
No, that's the challenge, that our projections now have the Social Security Trust Fund exhausted by the end of the budget window, and then benefits for all Americans would be reduced in a sense by more than 20%.
So literally in 9 years, people can expect they will not receive their Social Security benefits if Congress does not take some action.
That's right. Under current law, there would be not enough resources to pay the promised benefits of Social Security.
Yeah, I think it's important for the American people to hear that from you, and I think it's really important that if we are successful in putting together this fiscal commission, that we really go out and explain to the American people that what we really have here is a math problem. It's potentially a political problem as well, but if nothing is done, every single American will be impacted in the short term, within 9 years, every single American who's accessing Social Security, and potentially dramatic income or impact to current Americans, certainly to future generations, if we don't change course. Do you think we still have time to act, or is this something that will be difficult to resolve?
The challenge is knowing when that, sort of that period of crisis comes and things could be stable, and then interest rates spike, inflation spikes, and that's the challenge.
Yeah, thank you.
I think the gentleman from Pennsylvania, and yield 5 minutes to the gentlelady from Illinois, Ms. Schakowsky, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Swager, for being here again today with us. To me, one of the key findings and from your research is that immigration actually has a really positive effect on our economy. Unfortunately, yesterday, the Secretary Mayorkas was removed, doing nothing to help with the problem of immigrants or the border. But in fact, overall, immigration is a good thing. You found that it looks like that you found that you project that the economy could grow 7 trillion, was it, yeah, over the next decade. And then also that we found that the government itself, the revenue would be increased, it's estimated, by $1 trillion over the over the next period. So I wonder if you could comment on immigration, why it is a plus for our economy, and what you think comprehensive immigration reform, instead of just taking people out of their office, would actually do something.
Okay, no, thank you. And it's a key finding in our report is the role of immigration in the economy and in the budget. And of course, I recognize there are many aspects to immigration, and CBO, of course, will focus on the economic and budget, but I want to start by acknowledging the security and social aspects and many others. We do find that the labor force is more than 5 million people higher at the end of the 10-year window than we had previously expected, and that's because of the surge of immigration. And as you said, that more workers means more output, more income, and that in turn leads to the higher revenue, the $1 trillion figure that you mentioned.
So really the answer about immigration is that we need the workers, and we would have more workers if we had more immigrants that were in this country. Is that what you're saying? It's the workers.
That's right. And the domestic fertility in the United States, the number of births per woman, has been declining. And there's a sense in which immigration is now offsetting the decline in fertility.
Okay, the other issue I wanted to raise is about tax cuts for the wealthiest. You know, we see in your report that what we knew was true, that the Donald Trump's tax cuts actually drove a big hole in the deficit, and that adding to that, which is what the Republicans have said, would be a real problem. So while we've talked about spending, that somehow it's a problem, and then they always raise, the programs for seniors, for Social Security, that these are too heavy. Aren't we concerned about the issue of creating more deficit because of giving more tax cuts to the wealthy? And I'm just wondering if you think this is a good idea, that we continue to add more tax cuts for the wealthiest Americans, for the big corporations, or whether or not we ought to consider trimming that.
Well, our projections are based on current law, and the kinds of changes you're mentioning, additional changes in taxes, lower taxes, would mean a yet higher deficit and a more challenging fiscal trajectory.
So I just want to say that every time it seems on the Republican side of the aisle, when we talk about how are we going to make sure that we don't continue to build deficits, point at the things that make America great: Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, taking care of people ordinary Americans who really need help. So I thank you for what you said, and I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady, and now I yield 5 minutes to my friend from Texas, Dr. Michael Burgess.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I do want to associate myself with the chairman's remarks early on about the linkage between the vast increase in federal spending and the occurrence of inflation, which then subsequently impacted the inflation rate that has now come back to visit us in the form of higher interest rates on the national debt, to the point that interest on the national debt for the first time in history will eclipse spending on national defense. I think it's a very important point that people should not overlook. I mean, this was an intentional act that caused this. The other thing that I feel obligated to point out is that the people who were supposed to be watching this sort of stuff, that is the president of the Fed, that is the Secretary of the Treasury, absolutely missed inflation when it was occurring by almost a year. And had they reacted sooner with some interest rate increases, it would not have been necessary to drive the interest rates up through the roof the way they did, and subsequently now we're left with the situation that we're in. Now, you told me, I think it was May of 2001, when we first had an opportunity to meet, that you did not appreciate how strong the economy was going into and coming out of the coronavirus pandemic, that the economy was actually really hitting on all cylinders, and it continued to do that even in spite of some of the arbitrary shutdowns that occurred during coronavirus. Do I remember that correctly?
Sorry. Yes, sir, you do. That at the beginning of 2021, as the vaccination program proceeded and job creation was accelerating, the economy was reopening, I did not appreciate how strong demand was. And then I didn't appreciate at the time, since how strong the supply disruptions were that remained. And that is what the chairman was pointing at as well in his opening.
Well, I do think that's something we do need to bear in mind. The people who indulge themselves in revisionist fantasies say that the economy was flat on its back during the latter part of the Trump administration, but in fact that is not true. It was a strong economy, and it emerged from coronavirus strong because it went into it strong. The other thing that I just have to ask you about, the ranking member brought up that the cost of Medicare for a 10-year window has reduced greater than expected. And of course, he attributes to the Affordable Care Act. What is that time window that we're talking about? From when to when is that period of time where Medicare spending has been lower than what you expected?
Okay, yeah. So it's since 2010 we have had a lower growth rate of Medicare than the CBO had expected, and in our projections now we have Medicare growth a bit higher than that, but still lower than it was in the preceding decade before 2010.
Well, just as an observation, of course, the Affordable Care Act was passed in 2010, but the implementation was several years subsequent to that. One of the things that happened prior to 2010 was Part D benefits that allowed seniors to have access to lower-cost generic medications like statins, like ACE inhibitors that lower blood pressure. And the effect that these medicines had over that longer period of time, I would submit, is probably a greater effect than the Affordable Care Act, because we all remember one of the criticisms of the Affordable Care Act was that it was 10 years of taxes for 6 years of benefits. And indeed, the benefits, if such as they were of the Affordable Care Act, did not kick in until later in that time window that you're describing. Let me ask you this. Overall, has the Affordable Care Act increased or decreased the cost of health care in this country?
As an overall, oh boy, I apologize. I don't have a single answer for that. There's so many impacts and so much has changed that I was going to say, and among the other impacts, one that you highlighted is improvements in cardiac care, which reduced the growth of healthcare spending overall. Maybe some of that was from the aspects of the Affordable Care Act, the ACOs, the Accountable Care Organizations, but we know the cardiac care improvements mattered. We're not sure exactly what it was that led those to take.
Correct. Was it the availability of medicines at a lower cost, which is Part D, or the evolution of ACOs, which, again, I don't think they've paid off on the promise that was suggested to us when the chairman of CMS told us what he was doing with that. Look, there's never enough time. I've got a ton more questions, and I'm going to submit those in writing. And I appreciate also you working on the concept of what has the Affordable Care Act cost us over the time. I mean, it's been over 10 years since its implementation. You had 10-year projections. Go back and look at what you projected and what actually happened. I think that would be an interesting case study in economics, if nothing else. So thank you very much for being here, and I'll yield back.
I
Mr.
thank the
Chairman.
gentleman from Texas, and now yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Swigel, we've heard a lot about inflation. How is inflation in the United States compared to inflation in other countries?
Well, inflation has come down a lot in the United States. Our growth is stronger than most of the rest of the world. I don't know offhand inflation in the U.S. versus other countries, so I apologize.
Okay, and interest, you mentioned interest on the Social Security program. Doesn't the trust fund make money on higher interests?
It does, that higher interest, the U.S. government, both pays more and makes more with higher interest rates.
Okay, and then your study of the ACA and Medicare, are you looking, in your study, are you looking at the question of whether or not people delayed treatment, uninsured people at 64, wait till they qualify for Medicare at 65 and get the treatment then, making it a Medicare expense rather than an ACA expense, and the fact that treatment is probably more expensive than if they had gotten it under the ACA at an earlier stage?
No, that's right. And something we've looked at in the context you mentioned about expansions of the ACA. We've looked at it in the context of expansions of Medicare as well, that would people in some sense have better health with more access to health insurance.
And you talked about Social Security being unable to pay promised benefits at the end of 10 years if we don't do something.
That's right.
Now, how do, quote, pay promised benefits, how do the promised benefits 10 years from now compare to what people are getting today?
So the benefits that are payable are still higher in real terms than the benefits that people receive today.
Okay. Now, we know the deficit isn't just the revenue or just the spending, it's spending matching revenue. Is talking about the deficit going to do anything about the deficit? That's a rhetorical question.
I did not have an answer for that.
Are you aware that we reported a bill creating a deficit reduction commission to talk about doing something about the deficit? But before we can vote on it on the floor, we passed a tax cut of over $200 billion, mostly going to corporations.
Yes,
aware of that?
We've prepared a cost estimate for the fiscal commission.
And before we could vote on the fiscal commission, we passed a big fat tax cut. Can you tell us where corporate tax rates are historically?
The 2017 Tax Act reduced the corporate tax rate, and so it's lower now than it was before the 2017 Act.
And where, historically, go back 20, 30, 50 years, tax rates for corporations, where are they?
They're in if I remember right, is in the mid-20s, whereas now the average tax rate on corporations is lower than that.
Say again,
I apologize that I don't have
1920s?
offhand, but the tax rate before the 2017 Act, if I remember right, was around 25% or higher.
No, the rate was about 45%.
Was it 35? It was 35. Okay, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I
Well,
I apologize. I've worked on this in the past, but I don't have it at my fingertips.
Okay, well, the corporate tax rates are about as low as they've been in about 100 years.
Yeah.
Is that right?
It sounds right. I have to get back to you. I apologize that you can see I'm This is like the one number that's not coming to,
Can you say a word about the effect of a good economy on the budget?
a strong economy means more job creation and more revenue, and, you know, would tend to improve the budget deficit.
Spending in the IRA on the Internal Revenue Service, what is the effect on the budget of those increased spending on the Internal Revenue Service?
So our projections show that providing more resources to the IRS allows them to provide better customer service and put more effort into enforcement, and that brings in more revenue. It's about a 2-to-1 ratio, so a net of about 1-to-1.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I read it back.
I thank the gentleman from Virginia and ask Director Swagel if you'll follow up with him on the tax questions.
On the tax, I
It
will.
was 35% prior to TCJ, down to 21%, but he had other questions, and if you would, please follow up with
I will.
Mr. Scott. Thank you, and now I yield 5 minutes to another good Virginian, Bob Good, for his line of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Director Swagel, for being with us once again. I want to pause and refer to some of the comments that were made by the previous speakers from the other side. My very good friend from Virginia, Representative Scott, apparently doesn't want us to talk about the deficit and the debt, doesn't want us to talk about that. So we just want to recklessly, relentlessly spend money, but don't talk about it, which I would say is a precursor to taking action. Secondly, the previous speaker from the other side said that what makes America great is how much money we spend on government programs. I'm thankful to hear that she wants to make America great again, but I don't think that's through growing government programs, which further exacerbate our debt situation and why we're here today. Director Swagel, since President Biden took office, his administration has unilaterally, through executive action, spent over $1.5 trillion new spending, which has resulted in the 40-year high inflation that we are all suffering under, the 20-year high interest rates, which have caused you to have to revise upward the projection on the cost of the debt by about $5 trillion since the president has taken office. With respect to that executive action, the number of final rules published each year by this government is generally in the range of 3,000 to 4,500, according to the Office of Federal Register. So that's executive action, rules passed by the departments, the agencies, the bureaucrats who are unelected and unaccountable to the American people. In 2022, for each bill that Congress passed, the agencies issued 23 new regulations. In 2021, federal agencies finalized over 280 new regulations, and the final cost of those was over $200 billion. The average, it hits the private sector too. The average U.S. company pays about $10,000 per employee for the cost to comply with federal government regulations. Manufacturing companies pay double that, about $20,000 per employee, while small manufacturers, those with fewer than 50 employees, the regulatory costs from the federal government cost them about $35,000 per employee. This is from the National Association of Manufacturers. So Director Swagel, how much focus does the CBO place on the cost of proposed rules or final rules when creating the CBO baseline?
No, thank you. So we do look at both proposed rules and final rules and how they show up in the baseline. And as you said at the beginning, some of those rules have substantial budgetary costs. And so, for example, the baseline has changes in student loans, and as another example, a proposed rule from the EPA on tailpipe emissions that has a very large fiscal impact.
So President Biden's original proposed student loan transfer scheme was estimated to cost about $400 billion. In the pipeline now, with what he's trying to do as he tries to continue to subvert the will of Congress and frankly the ruling of the Supreme Court, how much has he got in the pipeline now with the costs projected from the student loan transfers that he's trying to do now? Is he trying to transfer that debt to taxpayers who didn't incur it?
That's right. So after his debt cancellation was undone by the Supreme Court, the administration...
Pardon me, not debt cancellation. That debt was
Debt
paid
forgiveness.
by somebody. Not forgiveness, transfer.
Transfer.
Transferring
I see
it
where you're
to
going.
whom? Who was that debt being transferred to?
Well, it's to...
Where was it going?
future generations.
Thank you.
That's
Other
where the
people,
deficit
other
goes.
people who didn't incur it, but go ahead. I'm
No,
I'm sorry,
I
that's
understand.
important to clarify.
Okay, no, I appreciate that. And he put in place the SAVE rule, so it's an income-driven repayment, and we've evaluated the fiscal impact of undoing that regulation, and that's, that's more than $100 billion.
Yeah, I think 125-ish was what we talked about in our education committee visit that we had recently. Would you say that implementing a regulatory budget would allow you to better project future costs by having a better sense of all the federal spending? Would a regulatory budget help?
It could provide us more information. The CBO evaluates some rules and regulations. We're not set up to evaluate every rule and regulation, so that'd be something I need to talk to the committee about, how we'd go about doing that.
Would it be feasible for CBO to publish sort of a master list with the baseline covering the budgetary impact of all the executive actions that meet maybe a certain threshold?
It's feasible in principle. It's probably not with our current staff and our, the current size of the agency.
The practice is harder than the principle, I understand. Well, I do have a bill, the Article 1 Regulatory Budget Act, which would require a regulatory budget detailing the regulatory costs similar to the annual budget for taxes and for government spending, and certainly would like to see that come to fruition, that bill. But thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman from Virginia, and I appreciate your mentioning of the regulatory budget. I hope we can debate your bill here, maybe even mark it up, and thank you for your leadership on that. Now, we yield 5 minutes to my friend from Texas, Mr. Lloyd Doggett.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Director. I appreciate very much the commitment of CBO to accuracy and transparency and to defending your estimates and your work despite some very serious partisan challenges this year. Mr. Scott just referred to one of them, but we had comments suggesting how in the world can it be that if you cut spending for the IRS that you actually increase the deficit. In fact, the first piece of legislation out this year, I believe the estimate was $114 billion added to the deficit by the first bill that the Republicans passed. Can you just explain in short, how can it be that cutting spending, which they want to do for the IRS and they keep coming back to it to protect tax cheats, how can that result in more deficit?
Oh, okay, yes, sir. So we look at the uses to which the IRS would put those additional resources. Customer service helps people, in some sense, understand their obligations and pay them. And enforcement helps the IRS go after people who don't meet their obligations. And those have a return. And that's the analysis we do in coming up with the 2-to-1 ratio that I mentioned to Mr. Scott.
Thank you very much. And of course, we have people on this committee all the time that are saying, oh, with reference to the budget deficit and the national debt, we don't have a revenue problem, we just have a spending problem. And therefore, they have proposed to, for example, zero out the work-study program that allows many students to work and study at the same time. Zero out family planning. And of course, this week, the biggest zero that they offer us, thanks to the Putin wing of the Republican Party, is to zero out any assistance for Ukraine to fight Putin. Let me ask you a broader question. If we just zeroed out all discretionary spending that we have, everything for NASA, for Border Patrol, for national parks, would that be enough to bring our budget into complete balance?
No, it's one of the challenges we face is that in just a few years, by 2031, the deficit will be larger than all of our discretionary spending.
And as far as the tax cuts are concerned, I believe joint tax actually provides most of the estimates on what a tax cut would cost. But in your report, have you considered what the effect would be of permanently extending the expiring individual Trump tax cuts?
No, that's right. That JCT provides the initial estimates. We then look at subsequent efforts. The last time we evaluated extension of the 2017 Act was last year. It was about a $300 billion cost per year. That's in the second half of the window after the provisions expire.
And is that just for the individual tax cuts, or does it cover all the corporate giveaways?
That would be for the entirety of the
About
expiring provisions.
$300 billion, and this is something...
A year.
A year, and this is something that comes up next year if, as some legislation's already been introduced by Republicans, if we extend those provisions, $300 billion a year is the estimate of how much it will add to our debt.
That's right, that was our estimate last year, and we'll provide more information.
When it comes to tax expenditures, they are pretty big spenders. And as far as the revenues and the spending are concerned, while there were some initial revenue increases from the Trump tax giveaways, isn't it correct that last year revenues really crashed down to earth, and there was about, as the data I've seen, is about $450 billion less than we collected in 2022 last year was collected?
No, that's right, that our projection of revenue for last year was too optimistic. And so 2022 was really a strong year for revenues, and last year was not.
And one of the other complaints that some have had about the budget deficit is that we added to it with the new climate law. And that in fact, the estimates of the cost of that climate law have been very low. I think there was one report out this past week from Rhodium Group that they might be as much as twice as much. Some of the people that would defend subsidies to the oil and gas industry, to the coal industry, to their death, are those who are complaining the loudest about the fact that we use tax credits to encourage people to go green, to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions. Does there appear to be a significant increase in the cost of these provisions?
Yes, that working with JCT, we project an increase in the cost. And as you say, that's more uptake. There's more credits for electric vehicles, for wind and solar, and that will add to the cost of
In
those.
short, it seems to be working even better than we thought in engaging Americans in startup businesses as individual families in trying to do something about the climate crisis. Thank you so much.
Thank the gentleman from Texas, and now yield to the pride of West Point, Georgia, for 5 minutes, Drew Ferguson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I'd like to enter into the record without objection a letter from R Street that looks at the Budget Committee's concerns about fiscal unsustainable outlook for the country.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. Director Swagel, thank you again for being here. As I've said before, I believe that you are an honest broker and someone who is incredibly bright, but I think you have an incredibly bad set of rules that you have to operate by. Let me go ahead and just touch on something here. When we were freshmen in 2017, the chairman and my colleague from Pennsylvania and Michigan here, CBO told us that the spending for a 10-year window in 2017 was going to be about $52 trillion, okay? Well, guess what? We're at about $82 trillion now, and I'm happy to give you all these numbers, but we got them from you. The revenue difference was in 2017 over the 10-year window was expected to be $43 trillion, and now it's at $62 trillion. And the deficits were going to be at $9.4 trillion. Now they're at $20 trillion. We consistently miss the mark on the accuracy, and this is true for both sides, okay? And it is really hard for both Republicans and Democrats to go argue their points with a sense of confidence when year in and year out, CBO gets it wrong. And I think it has a lot to do with the rules that you have to operate by, current law. You're not able to predict the changes in the economy that are going to be coming. But, look, we're off by several $100 billion on the IRA. You were off by several $100 billion on revenue from the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. And really the only thing that you do is you give the competing sides fuel for their arguments, okay, that happen to be wrong in many cases. So how do the numbers that you're putting out in this baseline today, and we're looking at 10-year windows, how are we supposed to trust that in year 4, year 6, year 8, and year 10, they're going to be anywhere close to accurate?
No, it's an important point that we've...
Damn right it is. I mean, when you get it wrong by hundreds of billions of dollars over the long haul, I mean, how are we supposed to trust the numbers that you give us that in 10 years, the decisions that we're making are going to be accurate Forget whether or not the policy is right or wrong, or, you know, if you believe in one thing or another, whether it's green energy or healthcare, whatever, wherever you believe that. How should we and the American people trust that when you give us a 10-year number, it's going to be anywhere close, given the abysmal track record of CBO over the last decade?
Okay. I can tell you, I am very confident that the fiscal trajectory is unsustainable. And so if there, you know, under current law, and that, you know, and so that's one of the key messages of our budget projections.
Okay. Well, I think that's something that we can all look at the numbers and agree on right now. Mr. Chairman, I think that we need to really focus on reforming the budgetary process, making sure that the experts that we rely on have the tools where they can make more accurate predictions. I think that is wildly important. We can have debt commissions, we can talk about entitlement spending, but if all we're going to do is take a CBO static score and we're going to use that for the basis of a political argument and a policy debate, we are, as I said to you the other day when you were here, simply shooting rubber bands at the moon. We will aim at the target and fail to hit it every single time. Would you agree that reforming your process to include dynamic scoring or some variation of that could be, and modifications along the way, would that be helpful in making better predictions out into the future?
No, I agree. We do some of it. I want to do more of it. As the economy changes, what does it mean for the budget?
What do you need in order to make that happen? You say you do some of it, but you're trying to do more of it. To me, trying is simply failing slowly. What do you need to be successful in that effort?
So I hate to come before the committee and say, give me more people, give me more money, but that's the answer I'm telling you.
You can do more dynamic scoring
can do
if you have more people and more money.
The agency has been shrinking since.
And so you're going to tell me, Mr. Chairman, if I could have just a few more seconds, you're going to tell me even when you had more people and more money and you were getting it wrong a decade ago, I mean, it doesn't seem to be the answer here. Do you need different rules, or can you do it with the exact same rules that you have now? Are you thinking about technology? Are you using AI? Excuse me.
No, thank you. Yeah, no, I mean, the rules of the House, the current House rules direct us to do dynamic analysis for major legislation, and we will absolutely do that.
The gentleman's time's expired.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Appreciate the line of questions on the budget process that will make us act more responsibly and you all provide more timely and accurate data. That's something I hope we're all committed to, and I appreciate. But I also had a thought: if trying is slowly failing slowly, I wonder what that means for Congress, who we often don't try at all.
Mr. Chairman, I surmise that based off of the last few years, we're not failing slowly, we're failing pretty damn fast.
That's. On that note, Ms. Ballant from Vermont, I yield 5 minutes for your line of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Dr. Swagel, thank you so much for coming this morning. The CBO's budget and economic outlook for 2024 to 2034 indicates that the economic growth achieved during the Biden administration will remain steady, inflation will continue to fall, and job growth will continue. After the COVID pandemic, we have a lot to learn from all of this and a lot to celebrate about the recovery, which has been the best in the world. But today, I want to specifically talk about an issue that's incredibly important to Vermont, which is housing. It is surprising to many people to learn that Vermont has the second highest rate of per capita homelessness in the country. And like many parts of the nation, we have many, many fewer homes than are needed. And this has made rentals and homeownership out of reach for too many Vermonters. But it's a national crisis too. According to a recent estimate from Freddie Mac, America is short by 3.8 million units of housing, both for rent and for sale. And that's certainly something I hear from a lot of young people as I travel across Vermont. Their concerns for the future about will there actually be housing for them when it's time for them to start a family. The average rent in the United States has increased by 24% between 2020 and 2023, and more than half of low and moderate income borrowers now spend between 30 and 50% of their income on mortgage payments or rent. And this cost burden is way too high, obviously, for working families and for the elderly in particular. And so this week, I introduced the Community Housing Act, and my bill would make a transformational investment in building new, affordable housing. It's rooted in innovative solutions that Vermonters have embraced for many years, such as community land trusts and shared equity models. And by emphasizing new supply and long-term affordability and protections for renters, we can get to the root of this complex problem, both in Vermont and across the country. And we can help more people and more families, but by doing that, we also help the economy, both in Vermont and nationally. And so my question for you is, can you tell me what the effects are that the housing crisis has had on our nation's economy, and looking out, how could increasing dramatic the units that are available for people both to rent and own, again, help the nation's economy as a whole?
No, you've put your finger on a really important issue economically and socially. And we've seen the impact of the Fed's interest rate hikes on the housing sector. We project pretty strong growth in housing based on the factors that you said, just in terms of the very strong demand for housing to continue. The supply side focus that you said, that in some sense, that is probably the policy, one policy lever to have innovative changes on the supply side. It would improve the economy, and it would have important social effects. And I think of the issues of inequality you mentioned, and others of mobility, people being able to move to the right job or the right place for them as a family.
And so looking backwards, and I know you're really about projections, but looking backwards, can you speak to when was the last time that we had a concerted effort federally to try to house all the folks in this country that are desperately seeking rental housing, a pathway to home ownership? It feels like it is holding folks back in my county, but when my state, but when I talk to colleagues across the aisle, this is something that's impacting just about every congressional district. There's just not enough housing. And just wondering, when was the last time we saw a federal investment of the size that's needed?
No, that's right. As you said, it's a local issue and a national issue. I can't think of the last time there's a full-scale issue. I mean, there have been programs with some resources. The American Rescue Plan Act had some housing assistance, but not the national effort that you're suggesting.
So in closing, I just want to say that the bill that I put forward is a $500 billion investment in housing. It is a big ticket item. It's what's needed right now. When we talk about nearly 4 million fewer homes that are needed right now, it's a real crisis, not just for individual Americans, but for the economy as a whole. Thanks for being here.
I thank the gentlelady, and now yield 5 minutes to my friend from California, Mr. Tom McClintock.
Thank you, Director Sagel. Starting on Ms. Shankowski's point regarding illegal immigration, your testimony is that the more people that are working, the greater the economic output. So on the macro level, that registers as an increase in economic activity, correct?
That's correct, yes.
But since illegal immigrants are generally lower wage workers, and we're flooding the labor market with them, what does that do to the wages for working Americans?
No, that's right, that the new immigrants will tend to go into industries that have relatively low productivity that will lower the level of productivity for the country as a whole and lead to lower wages on average.
Lower wages for working families.
That's right.
So
including for
the party that keeps touting itself as the friend of the worker actually is advocating policies that are suppressing the wages of working Americans by flooding the labor market now with more than 5 million illegal immigrants that their administration has released into this country, which I find absolutely appalling. Now, and because the illegal immigrants are generally lower wage earners, they pay relatively lower taxes and consume relatively higher government services. The Center for Immigration Studies estimates that on average, the net lifetime cost of an illegal immigrant is $69,000. That's per person. That's the costs consumed minus the taxes paid. It's a net loss of $69,000 per individual. Do you have any reason to question that estimate?
So it's something that we're still working on, is looking at the composition of the immigrants and the trajectory of their work profiles, and the benefits they would draw.
But there's no reason, at least at this point, not to expect that every illegal immigrant who is admitted into this country is a net cost to American taxpayers and is suppressing the wages of working Americans. Thank you, Party of the Workers. Let's go to Mr. Doggett's point regarding taxes. Tax Foundation reports that the top 1% of income earners earn 20% of all income, roughly, but pay 40% of all income taxes. Are those figures in the ballpark?
Yes, our tax system is sharply progressive in the way that you're saying between.
So they earn 20% of the income, they pay 40% of the income taxes. So if you're actually arguing that they should pay their fair share, you're actually arguing to cut their taxes in half, it sounds to me, which is a rather bizarre position for the Democrats to take. And what we found in California and a number of other very high-tax states is that Arthur Laffer was right, that there's nothing more portable in this world than money and rich people. When taxes reach a certain point, what happens to tax revenues?
As you said, people can move and move across borders, and that's something that we see when we look at state and local issues.
And that's why we see high-tax states like California, the more they raise their taxes, the more their tax revenues go down. In fact, when the Trump tax cuts took effect, the projection was that they'd reduce total revenues, but our total revenues actually went up after the tax cuts, not down. So how do you explain that?
No, that's right. So the challenge of making that evaluation is in terms of the event subsequent to the Tax Act. And we expected that to increase growth. It's just hard to distill the impact of the Tax Act from the,
But in this case, what we saw was taxes were cut, revenues went up. Now we're at about 17.5% of GDP on our revenues right now, according to your report. Now, isn't that about average for the post-war era?
That's right. The 17.5 we have this year is slightly above the 17.3.
And the highest amount that we've ever brought in the post-war era was in 1945. That was 19.8%. Now, Truman then cut spending, cut taxes dramatically, and between 1945 and 1950, we saw revenue decline to 13.1% of GDP, but the result was the post-war economic boom. Is that also about right?
No, that's right. After the adjustment after World War II, as you said, we had an economic boom in the 50s.
I just want to take on one other point that was just raised regarding housing. When something's scarce, it's expensive. When it's plentiful, it's cheap. What impact have rent controls had on the supply of rental housing historically?
Generally, that kind of policy would tend to reduce the construction of new housing and supply.
And therefore force up prices, not to mention 100,000 per home mandates, as we're seeing in California, zoning restrictions that constrict the supply of housing, and delays of years and years that add enormously to the holding costs for developers. So all of those are self-inflicted wounds by government, are they not?
No, that's right. And these are state and local issues generally, and the zoning that you pointed to is a key issue in the supply of housing.
I thank the gentleman from California for his questions, and now yield 5 minutes to our friend from Kansas, Ron Estes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Director Swagel, for being here today. The updated CBO baseline confirms some things that we've known for a while. We're at an economic and fiscal tipping point in this country. You know, every second we borrow another $90,000. So in the amount of time it took me to say $90,000, we borrowed another $90,000 and created this $34 trillion debt that's actually increasing at about $2.6 trillion if you look at the last year in terms of the amount of money that's been borrowed. And projections are that our deficit and our additional borrowing will increase by over 5% of GDP over the next several years. I'm going to vary off of what's on my prepared remarks, partly because of some comments that were made earlier, but partly just because to reflect on what's really going on. Yesterday, the Consumer Price Index, CPI, was reported for the month of January and went up. And the year-to-year went up. The month-to-month went up, above projections and above previous months. And in fact, one of the things that was noted earlier today was that the actual interest costs on our debt went up an additional $9 billion yesterday, just because interest rates went up because investors demand more money when inflation goes higher. And inflation's continuing to increase prices. You know, the amount of government spending over the last 3 years, when the Democrats were mostly in control, this splurge has resulted in actually now prices are 17.9% higher than what they were 3 years ago in January of 2021. And actually, it has a drastic impact on the viability of us, our net debt, our net interest costs, as well as the overall concern about what we can afford. The chairman mentioned earlier about defense, and the interest costs are going to be higher than what we're spending on defense, and as well as health and human services and agriculture and environment and everything else that we spend money on. So we've got to make some serious changes. You mentioned earlier that the Fiscal Responsibility Act helped bend the curve on some of that. Some of the other things have been talked about earlier is that, you know, discretionary spending, the piece that we get to vote on every year, is less than 30% now of our actual spending versus the mandatory spending program. So we've got to do some work. The Tax Relief for American Families and Workers Act that passed last week was a good bill to be helpful in terms of promoting economic growth to help keep our tax revenue coming in. You know, if we implement some of the policies to boost the economy and revenues, will we still have to cut spending in order to improve our nation's fiscal health?
Yes, sir. I mean, even with the strong economy and the policies that you know, the strong economy you have in mind, we still need to take action to adjust our fiscal trajectory.
And I mentioned automatic spending, but as much as we're spending now on interest, which has fallen into that automatic spending category, can you share how much of a percentage of our budget is spent on interest and how that's going to change over the next few decades, and what's the impact?
So in some sense, that's a key challenge, is that what we spend on net interest now is roughly equal to either defense or non-defense discretionary spending, a little bit below one, a little bit above other. Over the next 10 years, those interest payments are rising by so much that they're like 1.5 times the either defense or non-defense. And that is just an illustration of the point that you're making, that interest payments will just crowd out everything else in the budget.
And another question I've got is, does the CBO baseline account for some drastic differences in estimates? I know there were some comments made earlier about the process and what's used, and how do we ensure greater accuracy? I mean, there's other estimators out there, whether it's Penn Morton, whether it's University of Chicago, on key pieces of legislation like the so-called Inflation Reduction Act, which obviously the numbers were completely off based on the baseline estimate. So how do we reconcile and come back with better answers through that?
So we do our best to be in some sense in the middle of the range of possible outcomes, and we know there's uncertainty about all of our outcomes. We consult with outside experts, our panel of advisors. Ultimately, it's on us to, as you say, go back and look at what we've done, where we've got it wrong, and if there's a way for us to improve our process.
Well, I know you mentioned people and money, but I mean, there may be some of those other models to look at, to incorporate, to utilize as well. So, Mr. Chairman, I'm out of time. I'll yield back.
I thank the gentleman from Kansas and yield 5 minutes to our friend from the Hoosier State, Mr. Rudy Yakum.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing today, and thank you to Director Swagel for being here to testify on CBO's baseline projections. As we've previously discussed, the CBO plays a critical and vital role in providing Congress with objective and nonpartisan data to help us as legislators make the most informed decisions possible. CBO's baseline is important to understanding our nation's current economic and fiscal state, as well as helping this committee put together our annual budget resolution. This year's baseline does show some concerning figures about the fiscal state of our nation. Our nation currently sits at $34.2 trillion of debt, or 122% of GDP. And over the next decade, the CBO projects this figure to grow to $54.4 trillion, or 130% of our GDP. Additionally, this year's baseline shows multiple government trust funds going insolvent over the next decade. For example, the CBO projects that the Old Age and Survivors Insurance Trust Fund, which funds the majority of Social Security, will become insolvent by 2033, which would result in an automatic 25% cut for Social Security recipients. Let me state that again. If we do nothing, we will have an automatic 25% cut for Social Security recipients. You also project that the Highway Trust Fund will be exhausted by 2028. And these figures are very deeply concerning to me. While we cannot allow our debt and deficit to continue on this unsustainable and irresponsible path, we in the House must do something about it. So my first question for you would be, it's something that I'm very deeply concerned about is the rising cost of our national debt. Your report projects our annual interest payments to rise to $870 billion in 2024, which is a $211 billion increase from last year. How do our rising interest payments impact our long-term debt trajectory? Director Swagel.
These net interest payments, in some sense, are going to overwhelm all the other possible uses of our budget, right? We have the mandatory spending that continues on autopilot, and then discretionary spending will get overwhelmed or crowded out by the rising interest payments.
And so what are some of the fiscal and or particularly the economic implications? If you could just go there, talk about the economic implications tied to our growing interest payments.
Right, and that's to me, that's the real long-term concern, is that the rising interest payments, the rising deficits and debt will feed back into yet higher interest rates and have other negative economic consequences: lower investment, lower job creation, lower growth, excuse me, less ability for us to face up to our economic and other challenges.
In this, to that point, in this House, and obviously we need to restore fiscal responsibility. We talk a lot and almost exclusively in the House about the need to cut discretionary spending. In your estimates, I mean, the numbers are very plain and very simple. Can we rein in our debt and deficit with only changes to discretionary spending?
No, it's just not possible. Eventually, we have to look at other things.
Other things being?
Either mandatory spending or revenues.
Yeah, thank you. How does the CBO baseline account for the potential impact of regulatory policies?
We do in part. So we do our best to look at the regulatory policies that have been enacted, incorporated or put in place by the administration or proposed, and look at what's the economic impact and the fiscal impact. We're not able to detail each and every regulation, but we get some of the major ones.
And can you talk about how the regulatory costs under this administration, under the Biden administration, how it compares to the last administration? Has it increased, has the Biden administration's regulatory actions that they've taken increased or decreased the fiscal outlook, or I should say maybe the total projected debt over the next decade?
It's a really good question. I can't compare against the last administration. I just don't have that off the top of my head. I'm not sure we've even done that, but some of the major regulations show up in our budgetary projections, and the EPA and student loans and others.
And then briefly, last spring, we passed the Fiscal Responsibility Act, or the FRA, which imposed caps on discretionary spending for fiscal years 24 and 25. How did those spending caps impact our overall federal deficit, projected deficit over the next 10 years?
Yeah, so those caps and then the CRs that put them into practice were the largest impact in reducing our deficit trajectory. And that in total, that was about $2.6 trillion over 10 years.
All right. Thank you. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman from Indiana. We have 10 members, all on the Republican side, so we're just going to continue to roll through this. But I appreciate my Republican colleagues being here for this important conversation. So, Mr. Moore from Utah, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Director, thank you for being here. Look, the CBO's updated baseline shows that House Republicans, and in order to do this, we had to win the majority back, and we did that. And we've taken that opportunity and been effective at forcing the Biden administration to agree to lower federal spending. Unprecedented levels from 21 and to the 2021 and 2022, winning back that majority, we were able to put a clamp on that. That's a positive. CBO is now projecting that the federal government will spend nearly 10% less on discretionary spending over the next decade, largely due to the Fiscal Responsibility Act that was passed last summer. That's significant, and that's a significant conservative win that we were able to lower that and trim that out of the budget for the next little while. But while it's a great step, the updated baseline also demonstrates that we have a lot more work to do. Within the next 10 years, nearly 80% of federal spending will be on mandatory spending, and our annual appropriations process will only consider a shortening and a lessening 20% of what our federal government spends each year. My legislation, the Comprehensive Congressional Budget Act, which I introduced with my colleague from Washington State, Congresswoman Marie Gluesenkamp Perez, would reform our budget process to better empower members to make reforms to revenues, direct and discretionary spending each year. Instead of just ignoring $4.5 trillion of our $6 trillion budget, it would actually incorporate the entirety of it. It would do kind of like what states do and why states are able to keep their spending in a responsible trajectory, unlike us at the federal government. Dr. Swagel, a couple quick questions. This year, spending on interest costs that service the national debt will exceed the federal government's spending on Medicare and our national defense. By the end of the 10-year window, CBO projects our country will spend nearly $2 trillion annually on interest costs. What are the long-term implications of the U.S. growing interest cost?
No, it's a budgetary challenge and an economic challenge that rising interest costs will crowd out other possible uses of government resources and then also pose a risk to our economic stability, our financial stability, to high interest rates, to job creation, to economic growth.
Every constituent that comes into my office and they've got a program they care about and it matters and they show the data, how it's been effective, and I put a graph on there to talk to them about the interest costs and what it's doing to crowd out the things that we need to be able to address. Highest inflation we've had in 4 decades following inflationary policies. I look at the American Rescue Plan as a very, very rapid bill that happened really quick without much concern for what it would do to the inflationary pressure in the U.S. and, of course, the IRA, which is much more expensive than was projected. When President Biden took office, the projected yield on 10-year treasuries was 2.5% over the next decade. The updated baseline now, that number is 4.1%. This affects not only how much the federal government spends to service the national debt, but it also ripples throughout the economy. Can you speak to how increasing interest rates affect the economy writ large, particularly families and job creators?
Yes, I can. And you put your finger on it. Families, higher interest rates make it more expensive for families to spend, to do the things they want to do, and higher interest rates affect businesses that are looking to invest and create jobs. And both of those affect the economy and therefore the federal budget.
Yeah, and the inflationary pressure in the nation right now, like with Republicans winning back the majority, we were able to put a clamp on trillions and trillions of dollars that President Biden he enacted and was continuing to push. And that simply controls our monetary policy. And our monetary policy now more under control than it has been in the last couple of years. We're seeing inflation slow down. Prices are unfortunately here to stay because of what we went through those couple of years. But we are doing our part to put a clamp on that. Last question. The CBO's recent baseline suggests that Medicare Hospital Insurance Trust Fund will be solvent throughout the 10-year budget window. In the Medicare trustees' most recent report last March, they project the HI trust will become insolvent in 2031, resulting in an automatic across-the-board cut for seniors. What factors account for the difference between CBO and the trustees' estimate? They're different. CBO, it's solvent through the 10-year cycle, but the trustees has it at 2031. What factors are different? Why can't we get a consistent number here?
Okay, no, it's an important question. We have somewhat different modeling approaches, but we also have different economic projections. Ours is more recent, so in some sense we we probably have more of the higher inflation, which, is a negative for families, but means is there's more, more tax revenue coming into Medicare because we tax a nominal base. And so I suspect that's part of it, is that we have this is a slightly better revenue path than they do, maybe a better, lower spending path. We both see the system as facing severe challenges. It's just a matter
Whether
of
it's a couple of years or whatnot, it's still facing
That's
major
the big
challenges. When will the trustee address updated numbers?
sometime this
do you know that?
spring. Sometime this spring they will put out an update.
Okay. Awesome. Thank you, Director.
I think the gentleman from Utah, our deputy chair of the Republican Conference, which makes him the likely next candidate for Speaker of the House. With that, I yield 5 minutes to Dan Kildee from the great state of Michigan.
I thought you liked the gentleman from Utah.
Just,
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank you and the ranking member for holding this meeting. Mr. Swagel, good to see you again. I promise no references to professional wrestling, and I just made one. One aspect of the CBO baseline that I'd like to touch on is the projected tax revenues over the next decade. Obviously, we know Americans deserve working to lower our national debt, but reducing our deficit means looking at the entirety of the budget, not just cutting those programs that are important to families, to seniors, and to kids, but also having a tax code that's fair, one that does not allow the wealthiest individuals and the largest corporation in this country to avoid paying anything close to their fair share in taxes. Our tax code should not let Fortune 500 companies get away with paying less in federal taxes than a teacher in Bay City, Michigan, for example, or a nurse in Saginaw, or a factory worker in Midland. So let's just quickly review the facts. Under President Trump, Republicans added $8 trillion to the national debt, including nearly $2 trillion alone from the Trump tax scam. That gave overwhelming benefits to the wealthiest millionaires and billionaires in America. And now we see a desire to extend those tax giveaways to the super wealthy. So, Mr. Swagel, the CBO issued a report last May, and I know Mr. Doggett addressed this, but I wonder if you might be specific on this if you could. The CBO report last May dealt with this issue. How much would according to your report, how much would extending the Trump tax cuts for the wealthy add to our national deficit?
After 2025, when many of the provisions expire, extending all of the expiring provisions would run about $300 billion a year.
But just to be clear, when you aggregate that, the May 2023 report found that extending the Trump tax cuts to the wealthy Americans, large corporations, would add $3.5 trillion to the national deficit. That's what the report indicated, correct?
In total over time.
3.5 trillion, thank you. So, Mr. Chairman, I would ask unanimous consent to enter into the record the nonpartisan CBO office May 2023 report that found extending the Trump tax cuts would add 3.5 trillion to the deficit through 2033.
without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. Also, under Democratic leadership, for me anyway, one of the proudest achievements was capping the cost of insulin at $35 a month out of pocket for our seniors. Democrats and President Biden got that done. And unfortunately, Republicans opposed that legislation. Under this new law, we also gave Medicare the power to negotiate directly with big pharmaceutical companies to stop them from charging our seniors and others outrageous prices for the medications that they rely on. On February 1, the Biden administration took the very important step in implementing this new program, sending companies that make 10 of the most expensive drugs initial offers to kick off the negotiating process. And I wonder, Director Swagel, if you might let us know how much drug price negotiation program established under the Inflation Reduction Act would reduce our national deficit and save the American people over the next 10 years.
So our estimate was that the drug price negotiation you're focusing on would lower the deficit by just under $100 billion over the 10-year period, is $98.5 billion of deficit reduction.
Okay, so just for the record, I appreciate that. The proposal to extend the Trump tax cuts would add $3.5 trillion to the deficit. And the Democrats in the Biden administration approach to drug price negotiation would save $100 billion. I got that right?
Yeah, I think you've got the numbers.
Actually, you've got it right, because those are your numbers. I appreciate it very much. I yield back.
Yeah, thank you.
I thank the gentleman from Michigan. Now yield 5 minutes to our friend from North Carolina.
Thank you, Mr.
Chuck
Chairman.
Edwards.
Thanks, Mr. Swagel, for being with us again this afternoon. You testified just a few minutes ago that the CBO baseline had declined by, I believe it was $2.3 trillion as a result of the Fiscal Responsibility Act and the Further Continuing Appropriations and Other Extensions Act. Which of those acts accounted for how much of that reduction in baseline spending?
So in a sense, it's the sum of all of those, because the Fiscal Responsibility Act put in place the caps, and then the continuing resolutions, in some sense, implemented those caps over the sort of extent, the subsequent periods. And so that's why it's the combination of all those things together where the 2.3 trillion, as you said, was the savings just from the FRA and the continuing resolutions.
So 2.3 trillion is not nearly enough, but it seems like a pretty good start. I'm just curious, when in America's history have we reversed that baseline by as much as 2.3 trillion?
It's certainly not in my time as director. This is my 5th year. And that was why we highlighted it. It was a noteworthy improvement in the fiscal trajectory. I can't think of the last time. Maybe, I just don't know. I'd have to go back and look at past baselines.
Do you think there has been a time in American history when we changed the baseline by that significant amount?
I mean, the baseline would change with changes in the economy, with changes in legislation. CBO's had trouble predicting recessions. And so when a recession hits or a financial crisis hits, the baseline changes typically for the worse. So it could be that's been the case. And I just don't know those past baselines.
One of the other things that really caught my attention in your report, really because of the political noise that I keep hearing about, the economy is just booming, everything's going well. But when I look at the collection of individual income taxes, I see a sharp decline between 2022 and 2023. And you cite that the biggest part of that is because of a decline in capital gains. I'm having a tough time reconciling a great economy and such a reduction in individual income tax because of capital gains. Can you help me understand the truth between the two of those?
I can, and it's a challenge for us in projecting revenues because families get to decide when to realize their capital gains and pay taxes on them. So we can see the stock market going up or going down and know that affects capital gains, but the relationship between the realizations and therefore the revenues is indirect because it depends on family behavior. We had extraordinarily high capital gains in 22, and then we said, look, they're going to come down in 23. It looks like they came down much more than we expected, and that's one of the challenges that we face in thinking about what's our revenue projections in the future.
Do you see, or how do you see the collection of income tax on capital gains being an indicator of the condition of the economy?
It's an indicator in part that the changes in the equity market, the very strong equity market we had in 21 coming out of the pandemic, said something about people's expectations of the economy, but by far it's not the only indicator of the strength of the economy. But there is a relationship.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, I yield.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank the gentleman from North Carolina. You have 5 minutes to our friend from Oklahoma, Josh Burkeen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
No, I thought all my Democrat colleagues had just slipped on out the back door with all these very strong lines of questions over here on the Republican side. Jimmy Panetta, our friend from California. I apologize, Mr. Burkeen. 5 minutes, I should give you as much time as you may consume, but I will not do that.
There you go.
In the interest of time. Jimmy, take it away, my friend.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Josh, sorry about that. Director Swagel, good to see you again, and thanks for coming back. As always, I'm sure you'd like to see less of us, but we're glad that you're always willing to testify before the Budget Committee, and given your expertise and the CBO's very, very good work and diligent work. Obviously, the CBO's recent report on our debt and deficits, I guess you would say, is both troubling and informative at the same time. It really gives us a better understanding of the key drivers of debt and how it is predictable and predicted, to grow in the near and long term. It also gives us some hope, though, that as the deficit in fiscal year 2024 is decreasing when compared to fiscal year 2023. And so at this hearing, we got an opportunity to at least examine the report and take a good look at what is working and what needs to be addressed. And we can ask what we can do to increase revenues with or without increasing taxes, and we can reduce spending with or without making cuts to programs. But I guess first and foremost, let me just kind of say it, especially in light of some recent votes that this committee has taken. What are the odds that if we simply do nothing, economic conditions might change to a degree that deficits start to close on their own?
Stronger growth would help, but it's not plausible for us to have enough stronger growth to close the deficit on its own.
So we have to do something.
We have to do something.
And your projections for our Social Security trust funds are based on current law, which, again, I would say is doing nothing. What are the odds that without any policy changes, demographic shifts address our trust fund shortfalls?
Again, better demographics would help, more workers relative to retirees, but the gap in the trust funds is so large that it's just not plausible that, those sorts of changes by themselves would prevent the exhaustion of the trust funds.
Once again, something needs to be done.
Something needs to be done, I agree.
While prices are still high, our economy has been remarkably, as noted by many people throughout the world, I would say. Our economy has been remarkably resilient, and inflation is coming down, I think, which we can all agree on, based on the numbers, which could soon lead to interest rate cuts, as we're seeing. What impact does strong economic growth have on our debt and deficits?
So more growth, stronger job creation means more income and more revenue. It also means lower outlays for some things, the means-tested benefits, lower unemployment insurance payments and things like that. So stronger growth helps on both the outlay side and the revenue side.
Now, as we've seen, the unemployment rate has been, continue to be at pretty much almost at record lows. And clearly, it would help if we had people to fill those jobs. And I think that is where immigration comes in. Why does increased immigration pretty much, how does that help in reducing our debt deficit?
We have the surge of immigration from 22 to 2026, and our projections means a much larger labor force. And that means more workers, as you said, more income, and then more revenue, and that contributes to a lower deficit.
Now, clearly, obviously, we want legal, we want orderly immigration, but there's also policies that do that in regards to the H-2A program, or green card programs. Would those help in regards to reducing deficits?
The details would matter, but in general, a policy that increases the number of legal workers would tend to mean a stronger economy and lower deficits.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Swagel. I appreciate it. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
I thank my friend from California, now yield to my friend from Oklahoma, Mr. Josh Burkeen, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director, thank you for being here with us again. The debt at $34 trillion
comparative to our GDP. I think our new numbers are 27.5 trillion. Our gross domestic product, it's all labor, services, the cost associated, or the dollar figure associated with that. So we know we're in a historic high. We know that our public debt puts us at a 100% debt to GDP ratio. I think there's only 11 other countries that actually have the same level of debt to GDP out of 195 different countries. Reagan once said, we don't have deficits because people are taxed too little. We have deficits because people spend too much. Going to throw some numbers out and tell me if this is what you recall. In 2017, we had 3.5 trillion in revenue, and our spend, our outlays, was 4.9 billion. Does that sound correct?
I don't have it in front of me, but that sounds about right.
And then fast forward a few years, get on the other side of the pandemic, we have 4.4 trillion in revenue and 6.1 trillion in outlays.
That's right.
So if you look at that in a matter of number of several years, the 3.5 trillion in revenue has jumped by $1 trillion in revenue, but our spending has jumped much in surpass of that. If we would just maintain our level of spend, we would almost have been within $500 billion of a balanced budget.
That's right. If outlays had not risen, as you said, the deficit would be much lower.
So again, to Reagan's point, we don't have deficits because we tax too little. We have deficits because we spend too much. Now, part of that's mandatory spending. I understand that. The autopilot, the locking away things in mandatory side, we have to revisit that. And I want to talk about something that is increasingly alarming. As much as your time here, this is so informative for our country to have it from somebody that is not partisan. You are tasked with being nonpartisan to give the Budget Committee the best information. I want you to highlight, we are finding ourselves, you predict this year that our interest payments will match what we spend in defense of our country, about $800 billion to each. Talk about how monumental of an intersection that is, please.
These rising interest payments are a budgetary challenge and an economic challenge. And the comparison you make, I think, is a valid one. It's an important one, that we have to pay the interest. And that means that policymakers, you and your colleagues, have to make difficult choices about how we spend money or how we raise more money. And that's the budget impact. The economic impact, higher interest payments mean higher deficits, and that poses economic challenges. It affects our growth, it affects our investment, it affects job creation in the future.
And I love that you talked about how it affects our growth. It affects our growth because we're having to attract investment to take on our debt, whereas otherwise would be going into the economy. These people that would look for an opportunity to invest in something that could increase our GDP now is going into a more attractive feature as government is looking ways to have people finance our debt. There are studies out there that show once we get past, some studies say 78% of our GDP, debt to GDP, that you have a lag on your economy. Some say at 90%. Whoever is right or wrong, we're at 100% now. The Peter Peterson Foundation says when we get to 2040, 40% of our total cost, our total spend is going to be on interest payments alone. That's 25 years from now. How dangerous is that?
And that's the problem we have now would just be, greatly magnified. The difficult choices between deficits, interest spending and everything else, and then the impact on the economy and job creation would be much greater.
And when people use the term sovereign debt crisis, with Medicare insolvency hitting us within a number of years, 3 years, Social Security insolvency hitting us by 2033, do you think it'll take as long as 2050, when 40% of our revenue is devoted just to interest payments, for us to get into a sovereign debt crisis? Or do you think that sovereign debt crisis hits us much sooner?
The challenge is that I can tell you the situation is unsustainable. I can't tell you when, in some sense, we'll cross the line and we'll have that crisis. I don't know that, but I know at some point under current law, it will happen.
Mr. Chairman, I yield. Thank you.
Thank the gentleman from Oklahoma and yield 5 minutes to my colleague from Texas, Ms. Sheila Jackson-Lee.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Good to be looking at you from this location. I was eyeing it, but I dare not. Good to have you back.
Thank you.
And you will, as you sit, you are looking to your right, and they're my good friends, but you're looking to doom and gloom. And if you look over in this direction, you're going to look to a degree of excitement. First straightforward question I want to ask is the economy of the United States the strongest in the world?
Yes, the U.S. had strong growth last year. We project continued growth this year, and our growth is better than much of the rest of the world.
So I'm going to put on the record, when we were in enormous panic about the inflation, we now can say that we do have falling inflation. Would you say that is correct?
That's right, and we expect inflation to continue to fall.
What is amazing to me is the level of job creation. I do want to have you, since I'd like to be an honest broker in this, I think the job creation is stupendous, but you hear, I shouldn't say every once in a while, you hear this company or that company laying off 800, 1,000. What does that mean, even with job creation being strong?
You know, it's at the same time, we've had strong job creation, as you said. There's been adjustment in some sectors. The tech sector has faced adjustment in particular. And that's consistent with the growing economy, is that some sectors will contract and other sectors will grow.
I think that is very important because it can be taken out of context. Oh, they're laying off people by the dozens or the hundreds. What you're saying is that is a normal sort of economic influence, as well as industries sometimes are in the in crowd and some are sometimes out. Is that what you're saying to us?
I think that's a good way of putting it. Is one of the hallmarks of our economy is our flexibility and the ability of Americans to grow and in some sense to change with the circumstances.
So if you had to, if you had to just say what our economic outlook is right now, what would you say it is?
So I think our economic projection is overall a positive one. We do expect the economy to slow a bit this year as the Fed's interest rate hikes, continue to bite into the economy. Then we expect, some recovery next year, but continued growth, continued low unemployment, continued job creation.
Which is amazing, because I would say maybe 2 years ago, and then beyond, we were frighteningly in a panic about China. How would you compare China today to us? And you remember those times. China's, look what they're doing. We can't get ahead of them. Where are we now in that comparison?
No,
and what is China dealing with right now?
I mean, I look at people around the world wanting to come to the U.S. No one's trying to immigrate to China, right? There's no one wants to go there. The challenges they face, social challenges, economic challenges, declining population, the lack of freedom. In some sense, that's just a special thing about the United States is our economic vitality.
And that's what we need to tout, that the economy is not just numbers. It is economic freedom. It is social justice freedom. It is potential to think that you have a future, you can grow, or that you have an idea and you can make it into a conglomerate, if you will. Is that a good point?
No, I think that's right. And that fuels innovation, it fuels job creation in our economy.
So now I'm going to give more time to a question. You have not had enough, well, I'll say, enough time between the time you were here and back. But help me understand the value in knowing about history. We're in African American History Month, we're in Black History Month. I'll give you a little bit more time to discuss the question and value of understanding the economic engine that slavery was tragically used as, and the importance of having a commission that would study slavery and develop the response to that economic engine of a population that did work, build institutions, built the capital that we're in, and we not know what that dollar figure is and how important it would be. I yield to you.
Okay, I'll just say quickly, we haven't studied it, but I agree with you that the horrible things of the past, including slavery, play out in today's economy, in the inequality and injustice in our society, and a commission could look at those connections.
And finally, if we go into the housing market and say we want to help Americans be housed, because we talk about the unhoused, is that a valuable area of investment for America?
It's a key challenge facing us as a society, is the growth of our economy and our population against the lack of housing and affordability problems in the housing sector.
We should look to invest in that if we can. Well, we should look to invest in housing to grow the housing market for
No,
people.
I agree. It's a key challenge facing the nation.
All right. I thank the gentleman. I yield.
Thank you, and I yield myself 5 minutes for questioning, and we can look directly at each other here in this line as I sit in for Chairman Arrington. You know, my staff, as well as I'm sure everybody's staff here, spends a lot of time developing these questions to understand more of the issue. So I'm the grandfather of 10. Okay, this year we'll have our first 2 college graduates of the grandchildren. It goes down to the age of soon to be 15. So I understand from Dr. Swagel from Wikipedia, of course we know if it's on Wikipedia it must be true, right? But I wanted to verify it here for the record that you have 3 children?
I do. I have 3 sons.
Okay, and what's their age range?
We have 26, or about to turn 26, 22, and 20.
Okay,
So
so
25, 22.
let's assume, for the sake of discussion here, that this is not the hearing room, but it's the family dinner table, which for most children is painful because they're being interrogated by their parents and grandparents. You know, that's just the way it works. Life works in a good family. With all the data that we have passed back and forth between members asking questions and you providing answers, how would you explain at the family dinner table to your children, especially, let's say, maybe before they got to college, they were 17 or 18, but even today, what the problem is that we are dealing with here? How would you explain that to your children?
I would say there's a gap between what Americans want to and are willing to pay and what we expect.
How do you get them personally invested in solving problems and understanding their role potentially, but most importantly, if there is no change in what is happening here with the increasing debt, what the dire nature of the outcomes is going to be for them? Can you give me as a grandpa or anybody else here as a parent some phrases that we can help the next generations understand in their terms what we're dealing with here in this hearing room right now?
I would say the deficits we're running, the debt we're accumulating will undercut.
Give them an example. Give me an example that they can understand. I hear what you're saying, but can you give an example? If you spend more than you make, you run out of money if you're a family or an individual, right? And if you have debts already incurred, I mean, is there any examples we can use to help educate the next generations, the dire nature of where we are?
I would say it limits your choices. If you don't have the resources, it affects your future in a way that.
Do you think they'd understand?
I think they'd understand that we have to make choices.
Would they take action?
You know, that is the challenge.
How do you put them in a position where they feel that if they are not in a position to take action at that point, because they're not in a, either a legislative role or some kind of a leadership role or, appointed role, whatever, how do you build the confidence in them that those people that are currently in those roles are doing the right thing for the right reason?
It's, connecting these future choices to the situation.
How about action today?
Yeah, that's a challenge. I mean, education will help, that's for sure.
So when reality sets in, how will history, what will it write on your, epitaph, if you will, or my epitaph? Do you think it'll say, well, they didn't take action when they had the opportunity, or they gave it the best shot that they could at the time, and the results are what the results will be because good people didn't quit and they stayed focused on the issue at hand? We're here to talk about debt. You know, we've talked about a lot of things in this hearing. Very few of them have been really focused on next steps and way ahead on the part of all of us here in this room, to include the folks, you know, at CBO. That's the mutual challenge we all have. So I would ask all of us, especially, 'cause you do an outstanding job of explaining the issue, but will the 22-year-old hear it? With that, I yield back. I recognize the gentlewoman from Minnesota for 5 minutes.
Thank you for joining us again, Director. I know you didn't come prepared to give parental advice, but that was interesting to watch. This outlook looks better than expected, even compared to the pre-pandemic outlooks. Job growth is strong, unemployment is low, the economy continues to grow. It is clear that policies and investments centered on working families help support a resilient and dynamic economy. Supply-side reforms like housing development and expanded childcare can help strengthen our labor force, increase economic productivity, and grow our fiscal capacity. For example, the CPO outlook projects that net immigration flow will add $7 trillion to the economy over the next decade. Director Swiggle, can you explain how comprehensive immigration reform could keep improving our labor force and strengthen economic development?
Yes. It's, as you said, immigration would add to our economy. Our labor force would be higher. That means our income would be higher, our output would be higher, and that in turn would generate additional tax revenue. And that's what we have under the immigration we project so far. A reform could further those, those changes.
That's wonderful. Childcare is another good example of a policy that invests in our future and can have long-term positive impact for households and the greater economy. Our Education and Labor Committee passed important childcare provisions as part of the Build Back Better plan, lowering the costs for families and increasing the supply of stable, high-quality childcare should help improve labor force participation, especially for mothers, while still guaranteeing livable wages for childcare workers. Does your 2020 analysis of the Democratic proposed policies on childcare support these findings?
Yes, at the time of the Build Back Better legislation, we looked at those proposals, and supporting childcare would increase the labor force participation of parents, especially mothers, which would mean more people in the workforce. And for those individuals, the ones who come back to work, would mean higher earnings for them in the future as well.
Yeah, can you expand a little bit more in detail on the impact on long-term employment and earnings when high-quality childcare is affordable and widely accessible?
I can, and in some sense, that's connecting the policy today to improved earnings trajectories. As someone who comes back into the workforce, gains experience, as they gain experience, gain skills, their earnings rise and their incomes rise into the future.
That's wonderful. In last year's outlook, the CPO projected revenues to amount around 18% of GDP in 2023. But in this outlook, you're projecting revenues will amount to 17.5% of GDP in 2024, even though this time around it seems like there are even stronger economic conditions and assumptions. Could you explain this gap, and specifically what variables are you seeing that would lead to this slightly lower revenue levels?
Okay, and in a sense, it's both the numerator and denominator are changing. So it's both the revenue is changing and the GDP, the denominator, is changing. So we see a larger economy, which means that a given number of dollars of revenue will be a smaller fraction. And that, so even though we do have more revenues coming in with the strong economy, as a share of the economy, the numbers, our projection is smaller this year.
Interesting. Finally, can you account for, obviously we have this massive job creation, low unemployment, inflation is down. But it seems, and you probably heard from some of my colleagues, that people are still saying our economy is bad. What do you account for that?
No, it's a good question. I was going to say, I'm the economist and not the sociologist or psychologist. We've had several challenging years. The economy is coming out of it, but of course, many families' incomes are still affected by the difficult times of the past and the high inflation that we had. Even though inflation's come down, the price level is still high, and so all these factors are affecting families.
Well, thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman from Georgia is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let's start off with this because I just want to follow up with my colleagues' questioning here about inflation. What was inflation at the time that this president took office? Do you know?
Inflation.
What was the inflation rate?
In the early 21 was below the Fed's target of 2%. So it was
It was at 1.4%, right? And what is it now?
Right. So now the latest figures were that over the last
What is it now? What is it?
Above 3%.
Above 3%. So it's gone down?
Inflation has risen since 2021.
Okay, just want to make sure we got that straight. Okay, when he took office, it was 1.4%, and now it's well over 3%. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Swagel, for being here, Director, and I appreciate it. I want to talk about two things here today, okay? One is the cost of unilateral executive orders, and the other is the interest on our debt. Let's start with the unilateral executive actions. The economic impact of executive decisions made by the president. We know that this president has declared war on prosperity and opportunity. We know that day one, he declared war on fossil fuels and just destroying American energy and with that goal. And we should have, and we should have an entire hearing on just that, but we don't have that opportunity. But, two things. First of all, this president, he's talked about forgiving and tried and attempted to forgive. I shouldn't say forgive because my colleague, Representative Good, pointed out earlier, transferring debt, student debt, to other taxpayers, not forgiving it, but transferring to other taxpayers, and weakening work requirements for government programs and crippling our energy sector, as I mentioned before. But recently, he's also proposed a ban on LNG, which does two things. First of all, the economic impact that it has on this country, and then the environmental impact worldwide that it has. Both of those are tragic. But let me ask you, when you does the CBO, do they account for executive actions in your baseline estimate when you do your figures?
Yes, sir, we would. As an example, the export ban that you mentioned on natural gas, that came after our projections were set. So in our next update in the spring, we will look at that and say, well, what effect does that have, if any, on the budget?
Okay, do you anticipate it being a positive or negative impact economically?
I would expect that to lead to lower investment in natural gas, and that seems like it'd have a negative effect on.
Absolutely, I would agree. I appreciate that very much. So basically, that's my next question. Whenever we have these type of decisions, does decreased economic activity resulting from executive actions impact our debt?
It does, because stronger growth would mean more job creation, more revenue, lower deficits, and improve our debt trajectory.
Is it better or worse for our fiscal future to be energy independent and to trade our resources with the rest of the world, in your opinion?
The U.S., in terms of the
economically speaking, you're an economist. That's why I'm asking you.
Yeah, the energy boom in the U.S. has been a tremendous positive for our economy. So it's a complicated situation, but that's the big picture. Is a huge positive for our security and our economy.
Okay, let me ask you this, and I have it written down to ask my staff, but I'm going to ask you because you're the expert. Where does interest on our debt rate now as far as line items? Is it fourth? Is it third? Where is it?
It's, it depends on how you, how you tally it. I'll tell you, right now, our projection for this year is 870 billion, which is more than defense. So defense is 822 billion, a little bit less than non-defense, which is 917 in discretionary. So that gives you an indication. Interest is like about the same as we're paying for defense discretionary.
But if we're talking about line items, Social Security is first. What would be second? Medicare?
Yeah, Social Security is, this year we're projecting $1.45
Okay.
trillion.
And what would be second?
Medicare is just under $900 trillion, and then Medicaid and CHIP and others would be after that.
Okay.
So that,
But I'm talking about individually. So Medicare by itself is 900?
is just under 900 billion.
Okay, so then we would have the interest on our
Interest
debt,
would
and
be
that would
after
be
that.
third.
Yeah, that's right.
And it won't be long before the interest on our debt will surpass Medicare.
Next, in 25, that's what we project.
So in 25, the interest on our debt will be the second highest line item in our budget?
That's right. So in 25, we have 951 billion of interest is our projection, and Medicare is 940 billion.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Wow. Okay, thank you. I appreciate you being here today.
Thank you, sir.
The gentleman from Wisconsin is recognized.
Thank you. Couple of comments. The chairman of the Federal Reserve, Powell, commented recently on the state of the economy, state of debt. Could you comment on his remarks? Will it have any effect on future proposals from President Biden as far as the amount we spend?
I'm sorry, I missed that.
Will the comments of Chairman Powell
Yeah.
have any effect on, you think, on the type of budgets being proposed by President Biden in the future?
I mean, it seems like the Fed is staying out of fiscal policy, so it just doesn't seem like there's that going to be an impact.
Weren't there kind of some cautionary statements made by Chairman Powell?
I mean, he talked in his last press conference about the unsustainability of
Unsustainable, I would say that's a judgment call. And what did you take out of him saying our current path is unsustainable?
I mean, I think that message matches ours, that action needs to be taken to avoid, the problems arising from a fiscal crisis.
Right, and that fiscal crisis is caused by a deficit, right?
That's right, deficit and mounting debt, that's right.
Okay. So do you anticipate spending less on mandatory and discretionary spending because of his comments or concerns that you share with him?
No, I mean, no, like I said, the Fed, my interpretation is the Fed is really staying, out of fiscal policy.
Well, I don't know if that's the way I'd look at it. We have a lot of people coming here right now, and the high cost of housing is something that will destroy the middle class for the next generation unless something is done. I think we had at least 370,000 people come into this country in December. When I talk to my local landlords or developers, even as far away as Wisconsin, they see a growing number of apartments filling up with people who are sometimes should be viewed as illegals. Do you feel, and apparently you wanted to stick your nose in the housing market, at least in response to past questions, what effect do you think having this huge number of person coming in the country so quickly will have on the cost of housing, availability of apartments, that sort of thing?
Oh, yeah. No, it's definitely an impact. That, as you said, the increased immigration means an increase in the demand for housing. Initially, the new immigrants tend to live with family and friends.
Well, 370,000 is a lot, yes. There are examples of people with, 8 people in an apartment or something.
That's right.
But still, when you have 370,000 people, new people show up in a month, that's in addition to the people who are coming here, the legal pathway. It creates a housing shortage, right? I mean, that's what my landlords are telling me.
No, over time, the increased demand for housing will lead to higher prices and higher rents.
Higher prices and higher rents. That's exactly right. Does that concern you? Do you think in any case you might begin to prevent all these people coming across the border to prevent housing going outside the abilities of our young people?
You know, it's a challenge for families, the affordable.
It's a challenge. That's what it is. It's a challenge for you if you want to start out and raise a family, right? It's a challenge when the cost of housing goes up.
Yeah,
so
that's right.
Do you know how much housing has gone up, say, in the last 2 or 3 years, percentage-wise, both housing and rents?
I don't know, but right now it's a key driver of our continued inflation.
Right, it is a key driver. That's true, that's true. As far as, you mentioned that some people, some corporations don't pay taxes. There's been an increased use of tax credits to do what I think historically is done by spending money. I'm thinking of the green tax credits, I'm thinking of the low-income housing tax credits, which I think benefit primarily, property developers, maybe a little bit benefits people with lower incomes as well. Do you think that you may be amenable to getting rid of some of these tax credits, so on their tax returns, some of these big corporations can begin to pay a little bit more?
It's a key challenge for tax policy is the complexity of the code and the incentives that gives rise to. I can't recommend policy or not, but I acknowledge. I would say that yes.
You acknowledge that one of the reasons people don't pay taxes is we have generous tax credits.
No, that's right. It leads to complexity and has.
I want to get on one more question before I hang up here. One of the complaints I get for employers, and of course, we're always looking for more people to work, is that it currently seems to be we pay people not to work, okay? Be it you can't work harder, you lose your Social Security. You can't work harder, you lose your low-income housing benefit. You can't work harder unless you lose your health care benefit. Do you feel all these programs conditioned upon not working too hard, and they're all conditioned to a degree on working less, do you think that is a little bit of a drag on the American economy, paying all these people to not work?
Yeah, I mean, there are incentive effects of.
Overwhelming, baby. Aren't there a lot of incentives in our society not to work, or at least not to work too hard?
And that affects participation, it affects the labor force, and affects the economy.
Good. Well, we can work on that in the next budget. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Roy, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. It's great to have the director here again, a couple times in a couple weeks. Can I just get you to answer a handful of questions here, just so I can kind of clarify for the record from my standpoint, that CBO, in fact, estimates that legislative action taken this Congress, namely the Fiscal Responsibility Act and CRs, continuing resolutions, will decrease spending compared to the May 2023 baseline by about $2.6 trillion over a decade. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
However, once CBO accounts for other factors like economic and technical changes, the true decrease in the deficit over the next decade nets out to about $1.4 trillion. Is that correct?
That's right.
CBO also projects the federal debt subject to the limit will increase from $33 trillion at the end of fiscal year 2023 to $36.8 trillion in fiscal year 2025, a $3.8 trillion increase in 2 years. Is that correct?
That's right. I have the debt held by the public in front of me, but the debt subject to limit would go up just as you said as well.
Okay, and which is a fairly significant increase in the debt. I just want to make sure that that's level set. And so the CBO also estimates that discretionary spending will total $1.734 trillion in fiscal year 24, about $144 billion more than the $1.59 trillion cap set by the FRA. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right.
Okay, so I want to repeat for all those out there listening that when we have the FRA, the caps that are put in place, when people say $1.59 trillion, that the discretionary spending will total $1.734 trillion in fiscal year 2024 by CBO's estimates.
That's right. And in part, there's outlays that happened this year as a result of actions in the past.
Correct. But just so that everybody understands the numbers, that's the reality. That's because spending constrained by the caps does not truly reflect total discretionary outlays in a given year, right?
That's right.
As you just alluded to. It's fair to say that the widely reported $69 billion in so-called side deals under the FRA contribute in part, not in full, because there's advanced appropriations that are another piece of that and other factors, to pushing that true discretionary spending level up beyond the statutory caps. Is that correct?
Let me just say, it would, but just, of course, the current projections don't have any future legislation. So any future legislation that implements what, the you call them the side deals.
Right.
That's not in here.
Right, but a $69 billion in what are being widely reported in side deals in terms of taking money from other accounts and putting them in and then spending them, that would in fact, would not be truly reflected in those caps, is that right?
That's right. That would be on top of the numbers that we have.
Okay. If Congress were to strictly adhere to the caps in the FRA without using the rescissions, the side deals, the budget gimmicks, which I know are all loaded terms, to allow for spending beyond those caps, that would result in lower deficit projection, correct?
That's correct, yes.
If Congress were to pass a full-year continuing resolution under the FRA at a level of roughly $1.564 trillion with the proper wording, that would drive the deficit down even further, correct?
That's right.
CBO estimates discretionary outlays totaled $1.722 trillion in fiscal year 23, about $12 billion less than what CBO projects for fiscal year 2024. So is it fair to say that even after the passage of the FRA, CBO estimates discretionary outlays will increase year over year from fiscal year 23 to fiscal year 24?
That's right. In nominal terms, yes.
Is it correct that CBO estimates interest on the debt alone will account for about 15% of total federal spending over the next decade?
That's right.
When does CBO project that interest payments will eclipse defense spending?
So it's this year.
It's 2024 now, right?
It's 870 against 822.
And is it correct that CBO projects that interest payments on the debt will total $1 trillion in fiscal year 2026?
Yeah, that's right.
So that's what we're facing as a country. Now, I'd like to at least point out with respect to the conversation by my colleague from Texas regarding the economy was being kind of framed in all these kind of rosy scenarios. We just saw an inflation report of 3.1% yesterday, right? Which was higher than had been at least projected or hoped for.
Yep, that's right. Inflation came in a little hotter than people expected.
And in your all's own estimates, right? In calendar year 23, the economy did grow faster than 22, but as you guys are projecting, you project it to slow in 2024 amid increased unemployment and lower inflation. Is that correct?
That's right.
So it's not all necessarily, I would just posit for the record, you don't need to respond to this, all roses. We've got issues we've got to deal with. We have inflation that is piling up on the American families. That inflation continues. And when there's projections, as I believe CBO has, in light of some of those reports about the slowing of the economy, with the possibility of juicing it with interest rate cuts, what is that going to mean with respect to inflation? These are the complex environments that we're operating in right now, and we've got to be mindful of that in all of our policies. If we continue to spend money we don't have, inflation is going to continue to get worse. I yield back.
The gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Director. CBO's 2024 baseline has been released, and it tells a familiar story we know all too well. Our nation is in trouble. National debt now stands at a record high of $34.2 trillion, and it's expected to grow by more than $20 trillion by 2034, just 10 years away. For reference, our national debt has surpassed the debt to GDP levels we were experiencing during the height of World War II. Interest payments alone are expected to become our nation's second highest expenditure this year and are projected to surpass our entire defense budget and Medicare spending. Additionally, our Social Security Trust Fund is expected to reach insolvency in 2033, which would result in a 25% benefit cut across the board for beneficiaries. Of course, there's the added insult to injury of it being tax season back in our districts, and my constituents are looking at all the money being withheld on their W-2s and are wondering why they aren't seeing greater benefit to them. All of this goes to show how important it is that Congress stops the waste and begins to properly steward taxpayer dollars by following regular order, passing a balanced budget, and avoiding blowout omnibus spending bills. And in order to get there, the Congressional Budget Office plays an integral role in tracking our progress, or the lack thereof, through its forecasting on long-term budget outlooks and scoring of legislation to determine its fiscal impact. It's good to have you back, Director, for your second Budget Committee hearing in a row to discuss your role further. Director, CBO increased their projected labor force size in 2023 by 5.4 million people. This is a significant increase that your report attributes to higher projected net immigration. Can you elaborate on your methodology calculating immigrant population, and do you differentiate between legal and illegal immigrants?
Yes, so we do. We look at the different categories of immigrants. We look at the figures from the Department of Homeland Security, from the Customs and Border Patrol, at the immigrants who come in, with permits and green cards, and then ones who come in on parole, using the parole authority, and then ones who they call them gotaways, the ones who they estimate came in, but they don't track. And in some sense, that's reflected in our figures, is that the increase in the number of people released into the interior of the United States.
We know that this administration and Director Mayorkas specifically has abused our parole statutes and has been impeached by this House and is awaiting trial in the Senate. Based on reports from CPB and Secretary Mayorkas confirming that DHS is releasing nearly 85% of individuals encountered, there are already over approximately 5.4 million additional migrants in the labor force now. Does CBO account for the comments made by the Secretary that he is releasing 85% of migrants throughout the country? And what negative effects on the economy do you think that an enormous influx of illegal migrants can cause? I understand my colleague from California referenced that earlier.
Yeah, so we do take that into account, the numbers they release into the interior. And then we look at the budgetary and economic effects of those immigrants. And I said at the beginning, and I'll say it again, there are social impacts, there's security impacts, there's impacts on state and local governments. And so we're focusing on the federal impacts, but I'll be the first one to say there are these broader impacts. There are impacts on the housing market that Mr. Grothman mentioned as well. So there's a wide range of
So impact on housing, downward pressure on wages, as Mr. McClintock alluded to as well. Are you accounting for the federal benefits that illegal migrants are receiving from entitlement programs?
So some of those we do have in our budget projections. The increased population means that some people are entitled to say some refundable tax credits, and that we would have other benefits. Well, some of the spending is discretionary, and that that would be for future Congress. There's other benefits immigrants will be entitled to over time, and we're still working to analyze all.
And some of it is beyond the control of Congress. Right now in my home Commonwealth of Virginia, they are debating whether or not to allow illegally present children to access state-run Medicaid, and that will have an impact on our budget here federally, correct?
That's right. There's those state and local impacts that affect the federal government as well.
Are there data sets or information sharing agreements that you currently do not have access to at the state or federal level that you believe would help give CBO a deeper insight into the cost of illegal immigration?
The data are difficult because they're piecemeal. We've been able to get the data we need from DHS. Much of it now they've made public. So it's not that we can't get it, it's just putting it all together and understanding it. In some sense, that's the challenge.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Without objection, I would like to submit for the record an article by the Wall Street Journal editorial board titled, "CBO Shows the U.S. is Paddling Toward the Fiscal Falls." This article reiterates the growing debt crisis our nation faces. So ordered. Well, thank you, Dr. Swagel, Director Swagel, for appearing before us today. Please be advised that members may submit written questions to be answered later in writing. Those questions and your answers will be made part of the formal hearing record. Any members who wish to submit questions or any extraneous material for the record may do so within 7 days. With that, the committee stands adjourned.